You're driving to work, half asleep, coffee in the cup holder, and you cross a bridge without even registering it happened. A river passes beneath your tires, and your brain doesn't file it as an event. It's just road. But for most of human history, that same stretch of water, frozen solid in winter, was one of the most dangerous judgment calls a person could make. Step on it wrong, and you don't get a bridge. You get a hole in the ice and a current pulling you under it. You'd assume ancient humans just avoided frozen rivers whenever possible, except that assumption falls apart fast, because for entire cultures living in cold climates, a frozen river wasn't an obstacle to avoid. It was the road. Rivers freeze flat, wide, and relatively obstacle-free, which made them faster and easier to travel than snow-choked forests or mountain passes. So the real question isn't why ancient humans crossed frozen rivers. It's how they figured out, without instruments, without warning signs, exactly when the ice would hold and when it wouldn't.
Let's start with the physics, because this is the part that makes the danger real. Ice needs roughly 4 inches of solid, clear thickness to support a single walking adult. And that number climbs fast for anything heavier, a loaded sled, a horse, a group of people. But thickness alone doesn't tell the whole story. Moving water underneath erodes ice unevenly from below, invisible from the surface. A river might look identical from one bank to the other and be 4 inches thick in one spot and half an inch thick 20 feet away, right where the current runs faster beneath it. Ancient people had no way to measure this directly. They had to learn to read a surface that was actively lying to them. So how did they read it? Color turned out to be one of the most reliable clues available, and cultures across the Arctic and subarctic learned this independently. Clear, dark blue-black ice is usually the strongest because it forms slowly from consistently frozen water with few trapped air pockets. White, opaque, or gray ice is weaker, often formed from snow that partially melted and refroze, riddled with air bubbles that make it brittle. Indigenous Siberian communities and Arctic peoples like the Inuit passed down specific color vocabulary for ice safety, distinguishing at a glance between ice that would hold a sled dog team and ice that wouldn't hold a child. This wasn't folklore. It was compressed generational data, refined by every person who got it right and every person who didn't.
Sound was the second major clue, and it's the one that still makes people's skin crawl today. Solid, thick ice makes a deep, resonant thud when struck or walked on. Thin ice makes a hollow, higher-pitched sound, sometimes with an audible crack that travels outward before anything even breaks. Experienced travelers would deliberately strike the ice ahead of them with a long pole or staff, listening for that pitch before committing their weight. A crack that ran but didn't widen might mean the ice was adjusting, settling, still safe. A crack accompanied by water bubbling up through it meant get off immediately. Tools mattered as much as knowledge. Long wooden staffs, often tipped with metal or bone, served double duty, testing the ice ahead and providing something to grab onto if the surface gave way. Siberian reindeer herders developed specific staff techniques passed from parent to child, tapping in a rhythm that let an experienced ear judge thickness from the sound alone. Sleds were built wide and low specifically to distribute weight across more surface area, the same principle behind modern snowshoes, spreading a person's body weight over enough ice that no single point bore too much pressure. Groups crossing together learned to spread out rather than cluster, so that if the ice failed under one person, it wouldn't immediately fail under everyone standing nearby.
But knowledge and tools didn't erase the danger. They just reduced it. Archaeological and historical records across Scandinavia, Siberia, and North America document seasonal drownings that happened with grim regularity, often to the most experienced travelers, the ones who crossed constantly and eventually met the one crossing that didn't match the pattern. Oral traditions across multiple unconnected cultures include specific warnings about the most dangerous stretches of ice, near river bends where currents run faster, near points where warm springs feed into the river from below, near areas where earlier ice had visibly cracked.
This information didn't stay abstract. It got attached to specific places, specific stories, specific names of people who didn't make it, because a story is a much better warning system than a statistic. Timing was its own discipline entirely. Ancient and traditional communities tracked ice safety seasonally, often tying river crossings to specific points in a lunar or seasonal calendar, not because of superstition, but because temperature patterns repeated reliably enough that timing became a genuine predictive tool. Crossing too early in the freeze meant thin, unstable ice that hadn't finished solidifying. Crossing too late in the spring meant ice that looked identical to the eye, but had already begun weakening from below as temperatures rose, sometimes losing half its structural strength while looking completely unchanged on the surface. Getting this timing right wasn't guesswork. It was inherited pattern recognition, refined over generations of exactly the kind of trial and error that costs lives when it goes wrong.
And there's a detail here that rarely gets mentioned, one that changes how you think about all of this. The animals traveling with these groups were often better ice readers than the humans. Sled dogs, horses, and reindeer would frequently stop, refuse to move forward, or actively pull away from a stretch of ice that looked completely fine to a human eye. Experienced travelers learned to trust this hesitation completely, because the animals were picking up on subtle vibrations, sounds, or even smells related to the water below that human senses simply couldn't detect. Entire crossing strategies in Siberian and Scandinavian traditions incorporated animal behavior as a primary safety check, not a backup one. If the lead dog stopped, the whole team stopped. No argument, no override. This wasn't superstition dressed up as tradition. It was accumulated evidence that a non-human nervous system was picking up real signals that human judgment alone would miss. There's also something worth noting about how differently various cultures approached the exact same problem, all arriving at broadly similar solutions independently. Norse communities developed specific terminology distinguishing at least half a dozen categories of river and lake ice, each tied to a different acceptable use: walking, sledding, or forbidden entirely. Northern Chinese and Mongolian steppe cultures developed similar staff testing techniques for crossing frozen rivers during trade routes, entirely disconnected from European or Arctic knowledge systems. The problem of frozen water was universal wherever humans lived through real winters, and the solution, in broad strokes, kept converging on the same core techniques: test before you trust, distribute your weight, listen closely, and never travel that stretch alone. So here's the full picture. Reading ice safely required color vocabulary, sound recognition, weight distribution, spacing between travelers, and seasonal timing, an entire interlocking system of knowledge that had to be taught, practiced, and passed down precisely, because there was no room for improvisation once you were already standing on the ice. This wasn't a single trick or a lucky guess. It was a complete body of environmental knowledge, as sophisticated in its own way as any survival skill from this era, built entirely from people paying close attention to a surface that could kill them and refusing to let that knowledge die with them. And that's really what this comes down to. Every stretch of frozen river that got crossed safely represents thousands of tiny observations, compressed and passed forward, so that the next person crossing didn't have to learn everything from scratch, didn't have to risk their own life just to relearn what someone else already paid for. The tragedy is that this kind of knowledge is almost invisible in the historical record. Nobody wrote it down in the moment, because the people who knew it best weren't scholars. They were reindeer herders, hunters, traders, people whose survival depended on getting it right, not on documenting it for someone centuries later. So the next time you cross a bridge without a second thought, remember that the ease itself is the achievement. Somewhere underneath that convenience is a debt owed to generations of people who tested ice with a wooden staff, listened for the difference between a safe crack and a dangerous one, and passed that knowledge forward so the danger could eventually disappear entirely, replaced by steel, concrete, and a bridge you don't even notice you're driving over.